He didn't look like a monster. He looked like someone you'd trust. Quiet, polite, elderly. But behind that face was one of the most disturbing minds in American history. This is the story of Albert Fish. New York City at the turn of the 20th century was a city built on anonymity. Millions of immigrants poured into crowded neighborhoods, boarding houses, and tenement buildings. Families lived stacked on top of one another, yet often knew very little about the people next door. Children roamed streets and hallways freely, watched over by neighbors who believed the danger came from outsiders, not from the elderly man down the block. This environment created blind spots, and Albert Fish lived inside those blind spots. He was thin, frail, and soft-spoken. His hair grayed early, his posture slouched. He carried himself not with confidence but with submission. To most people, he looked like a man who needed help, not someone capable of causing harm. Fish understood this instinctively. He learned that society lowers its guard around the elderly, the religious, and the quiet. He dressed modestly. He spoke politely. He smiled gently. He rarely raised his voice. This chapter sets the stage for the most unsettling truth of the case. Albert Fish did not hide in shadows. He hid in plain sight. Albert Hamilton Fish was born in 1870 to parents already near the end of their lives. His father, a man in his 70s, died when Albert was still a young child. The loss left him emotionally untethered at a critical stage of psychological development. Unable to care for him alone, his mother placed him in an orphanage. The orphanage was not a place of care, it was a place of control. Children were beaten for minor infractions. Discipline was physical and public. Pain was not a consequence, it was a language. Albert later described being whipped, humiliated, and isolated repeatedly. But something inside him reacted differently. Instead of fear, he felt stimulation. Instead of trauma, he felt awakening. Years later, Fish would admit that this was the period when pain became intertwined with pleasure in his mind. Punishment became something to seek rather than avoid. Authority became something to submit to, and later, something to imitate. Psychologists believe this is where the foundations of his later behavior were set. A brain conditioned to associate suffering with meaning. When his mother eventually reclaimed him, she unknowingly brought home a child already shaped by violence. As Fish grew older, his obsessions took on religious framing. He became deeply fixated on sin, punishment, and divine command. He believed suffering purified the soul. Pain to him was not just physical, it was spiritual currency. He began engaging in extreme self-harm rituals. He whipped himself. He starved himself. He deliberately inflicted pain in ways that would remain hidden beneath clothing. Later medical examinations revealed dozens of sewing needles embedded deep within his body, inserted intentionally over years as acts of devotion and punishment. Some had rusted in place. Doctors struggled to understand how a human being could endure such pain willingly. But to Fish, pain was familiar. It was home. This chapter explores how religion did not restrain his impulses, it justified them. Outwardly, Albert Fish lived a life that appeared functional, even mundane. He married, he had 6 children. He worked odd jobs that required little oversight: painter, handyman, laborer. He attended church regularly. He quoted scripture. He presented himself as humble and obedient. Neighbors described him as odd but harmless, quiet, forgettable. Behind closed doors, however, Fish lived a life of ritualized obsession. He kept notebooks. He recorded impulses. He planned. He fantasized. This duality is critical to understanding the case. Albert Fish was not impulsive chaos. He was controlled, deliberate, and patient. That patience made him dangerous. In 1924, 8-year-old Francis MacDonald disappeared while playing near his home. When his body was found days later, investigators were confronted with violence far beyond what they typically encountered. The crime was personal, excessive, intentional. There was no robbery, no accident, no random rage. The case baffled police. In an era without DNA, forensic profiling, or centralized databases, there was little they could do. No one connected the crime to Albert Fish because no one had reason to. Years later, Fish would confess calmly, without emotion. Francis represents the moment where fantasy became reality. The moment where Fish learned that he could act and remain invisible. Billy Gaffney was 4 years old when he disappeared from his apartment building in Brooklyn. A neighbor later recalled seeing an elderly man guiding the boy away. That image, vague and fleeting, was all investigators ever had. Billy's body was never recovered. Years later, Fish claimed responsibility. Whether every detail of his confession was accurate remains debated, but the outcome is undeniable. Billy never came home. This chapter is about absence, about the cruelty of unanswered questions, about families forced to live without certainty, closure, or remains. Billy's case underscores how silence can be just as devastating as violence. Grace Budd was just a decade old when Albert Fish entered her family's life. He posed as a farmer seeking help. He was polite, patient, and convincing. He did not rush. He earned trust. When Grace left with him, there was no struggle, no alarm, no suspicion. For 6 years, her family lived without answers. Then the letter arrived. Written calmly, neatly, and without remorse, it detailed the crime in horrifying specificity. The purpose of the letter was not confession, it was reliving the experience. Ironically, Fish's need to revisit the crime led directly to his capture. When police arrested Albert Fish, he did not resist. He confessed quickly, almost eagerly. Medical examinations revealed the extent of his self-inflicted injuries. Psychiatrists debated whether he was insane or profoundly evil. The consensus: he was deeply disturbed, but aware. Fish understood right and wrong. He simply believed his actions were justified. By the time Albert Fish went to trial in 1935, the case had already captured the attention of the entire country. Newspapers printed lurid headlines. Reporters packed the courtroom. The public wasn't asking if he was guilty. They were asking how a man like this could exist. The core question of the trial was not whether Albert Fish committed murder. He openly admitted to it. The question was whether he was legally insane. The defense. Insanity Fish's defense team centered their strategy on his long history of mental illness. Psychiatrists testified about his extreme religious delusions, his self-inflicted injuries, his belief that God commanded him to act, his lifelong obsession with pain and punishment. Doctors described him as a man deeply disconnected from normal human psychology, someone who lived in a private moral universe shaped by trauma, obsession, and delusion. X-rays of his body were shown in court, revealing dozens of sewing needles embedded deep within his pelvis, visual proof of the extent of his self-harm. The defense argued that no sane person could endure such suffering willingly, let alone commit such crimes. The prosecution, awareness, and control. The prosecution focused on something far more damning. They argued that Albert Fish planned his crimes. took steps to avoid detection, used deception and patience, understood consequences, chose victims deliberately. Witnesses testified that Fish knew right from wrong. He simply believed he was justified. The prosecution emphasized that Fish didn't act impulsively. He waited, he prepared, he hid in plain sight. And most importantly, he knew society would condemn him and acted anyway. The verdict, after weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated for less than 10 minutes. The verdict was unanimous. Guilty, Albert Fish was sentenced to death. There was no visible reaction, no protest, no collapse. He simply nodded. On January 16, 1936, Albert Fish was led into the execution chamber at Sing Sing Prison in Ossining, New York. He was 65 years old. Witnesses described him as calm, almost indifferent. There was no dramatic final speech, no apology, no acknowledgement of the families left behind. As he was strapped into the electric chair, prison officials noticed something unsettling. Despite everything, the trial, the sentence, the impending death, Fish appeared detached, as though the moment held little meaning for him. When the switch was thrown, witnesses later reported smoke rising from his head, a strong burning odor, violent physical reactions. After several jolts, Albert Fish was pronounced dead. With his execution, the legal chapter of the case ended, but the psychological and cultural impact was only beginning. Albert Fish quickly became one of the most studied criminals in American history. Criminologists, psychologists, and law enforcement agencies examined his case for decades, trying to understand how trauma, religion, and pathology combined so catastrophically. He became a reference point in criminal psychology, behavioral profiling discussions of insanity versus responsibility. But there is a danger in that attention. When cases like this are remembered only through the lens of the killer, the victims risk becoming footnotes. This chapter deliberately turns the focus back where it belongs. The children Francis McDonnell, a child whose life ended in violence, long before forensic science could offer answers. Billy Gaffney, a child who vanished, leaving behind only memories and unanswered questions. Grace Budd, a child whose name became inseparable from one of the most infamous confessions in American crime history. They were not symbols, they were children, and their stories deserve to be remembered without sensationalism. Albert Fish's crimes forced society to confront uncomfortable truths. That evil can appear harmless, that trust can be exploited, that mental illness and accountability can coexist, that monsters do not always look monstrous. His case reminds us that vigilance, compassion, and awareness are not paranoia. They are protection. Albert Fish wanted to be remembered, and in many ways he was. But memory does not equal meaning. The true legacy of this case is not the name of a killer. It is the lives that were taken, the families who carried grief forward, and the lesson that evil doesn't always arrive screaming. Sometimes it knocks politely. This was never his story. It was always theirs. This was part 1 of a 3-part series about Albert Fish. Chapter 2, we will discuss how these crimes have shaped today's modern profiling techniques. Chapter 3 will be about comparing Fish to other methodical offenders. This was Tales from the Tombs NJ. Thank you all for watching, and please don't forget to subscribe for alerts when the next chapters come out. Until next time.